Among world builders and fantasy writers, there is one universal and crucial concept that, if ignored or mistreated, always causes problems. I've mentioned it so many times in passing in prior videos that it almost didn't occur to me that it definitely deserves its own bespoke video. The most it's got up until now is a not even 2-minute section of my world building mistakes video, so we're gonna fix that. And this crucial topic is the tempo or the pace of your world building. Very few people working in the fantasy or speculative fiction genres have to be told to world build more than they are naturally going to want to do. Often the thing that draws writers to genres like these is for the freedom of being able to shape a world to your own whim so that it can be perfectly crafted for the type of story you want to tell. And you can adjust the presence or absence of real-world contexts to your liking. It gives you a lot of control. Typically, we thus end up world building quite a lot, having entire documents or even using a variety of third-party programs to help us keep track of everything we write for our world. And there's plenty of value to doing this. Not only is it fun and a good way to stay in the headspace needed to continue writing for your world, but when done with care, it'll help said world feel more authentic, whether building it into something entirely divorced from reality or a believable mirror to it. A problem may arise when in the actual narrative of your writing, whether it's in the first pages of a novel or the first hours of a tabletop RPG game or whatever format, you dump all of this world building on your audience and it becomes suddenly immensely uninteresting to them. There are people out there, no small number of them, who will absolutely tear through even extremely dense world building presented very early on. But generally speaking, someone being presented with the vast 10,000-year arc of your world's history in one big chunk as their first experience of your writing is going to result in them being overwhelmed, confused, and then, if nothing more digestible is presented, bored. So what do you do then? Don't info dump. Boom, video over, see you in a week or two. Don't info dump can mean a lot of things though, and as most phrases of that sort are, it isn't actually very helpful in of itself. Because not only can info dumping look very different depending on the context, but the level to which at least a little bit of it is reasonable is also going to vary a lot. World building is a spice in the dish that is your narrative. Most people with working taste buds agree that a dish entirely lacking in seasoning or spice is going to be bland, uninteresting, and most importantly, something they won't finish. It's possible to overdo it. If you empty the cayenne pepper shaker into your dish, you'll end up with something that is less food and more of a spicy version of trying to swallow dry cinnamon, which would likely not be particularly more pleasant than the unspiced version. It might therefore seem that, yep, just get that happy medium is the answer, but it, once again, is lacking nuance, because some dishes need a lot more spice than others, and some need quite a bit less. And now that we're all thinking about food, I can pivot to say that my point here is the infinite variance of writing means that a lot of balancing out the pacing of your world building is just going to come down to your knowledge of your own work, but the rest of this video is going to focus on some pointers and general trends that might help you get set in the right direction. I mean, a lot of the things we do on this channel are taking basic concepts and just expanding on them, because writing is too complicated to be taught via basic phrases like don't overdo it, show don't tell, and that sort of thing. But regarding all of this, I do know the wrong direction to go in, because as all fantasy writers have likely done before, I have definitely overdone it in the past. We're going to pivot in a direction you may not have expected now, and that's fantasy/speculative fiction's interesting relationship with the humble prologue. A pretty universal joke with practically infinite variance, and it exists for good reason, is that every fantasy novel starts with the overlong prophetic prologue talking about how generic farm boy, good guy von Heroton, despite having literally nothing notable about him whatsoever, is actually destined to become the bestest, coolestest guy ever and slay the dragon and rule the kingdom and all that sort of thing, as opposed to dying of dysentery at age 19 or being assassinated after his third day in office, because ruling a kingdom is more than just aura and hype moments. I'm not that much of a cynic, and the prologue prophecy can be fine, but in the current zeitgeist, you essentially need to immediately defy expectations if you're going to do that that sort of thing, but that's getting us a little off topic. But there is something out there that will help keep you on topic and focused, as you'll be able to keep everything organized with today's sponsor, World Anvil. Writing is complicated. World building is complicated, especially when you're working with sci-fi, fantasy, or other speculative fiction. Keeping track of all of your relevant information from characters to countries to magic systems can be tricky, and it's very easy to get very disorganized. However, World Anvil just might be the solution to those problems. It's got a ready-made template and format for all your writing and world building needs, making it easy to get all your information down and keep it in proper order. Need templates to keep track of character information? World Anvil can do that. Need an interactive map so you can develop the unique personality of each country? World Anvil covers that. Need templates for magic systems? Need timelines? All of these sorts of things World Anvil can cover for you. I don't need to tell you that the histories of fantasy worlds can get very detailed and complex quickly, so having visuals to help you keep it all together is very useful. Altogether, it can really get you that wiki vibe where all your world building is part of a solid ecosystem, where you can jump from one topic to the next with ease and add to any given subtopic as you feel like. So if World Anvil sounds like the answer to your writing and world building needs, check them out at worldanvil.com and use the coupon code JBAT for a 51% off discount on any yearly membership. That's worldanvil.com, which will be linked in the description below. One more time, that's code JBAT for 51% off an annual plan, and thank you for not skipping the sponsor. My point with all of that, which has been said previously, is that the prologue is both the best and the worst place to get some world building established early on. It is worth doing some world building early. That's why I made such a big deal of finding the right balance for your story and not just saying, don't world build at the beginning, because your initial world building is what actually gives the audience a setting, and no matter how sick one might be of overdone world building, every story needs a setting. Prologues are the best place to do this in one sense because you can have a different perspective from the rest of your narrative in an easily justifiable way. Even if you don't do the whole detached prophecy thing, prologues are a great place to work with a secondary or tertiary character, even one we won't see again for a while or ever, just to set the scene and establish the world, but actually have a character whose eyes you're seeing it through, which is a good boredom preventer and context establisher. A character reacting to the world around them will almost always be more interesting than a detached narrator talking about it. Good prologues, especially ones which, like I'm suggesting, build off of a character that isn't the protagonist, do just work like very small, full stories, even if they don't resolve all the way due to being, a prologue, an introduction to something. However, from another angle, you can also say that prologues are the worst place to do initial world building. If you aren't careful, I'm sure someone somewhere has done this thing I'm about to say in a perfectly decent way. But if you do just want a narrator to explain concepts of the world in some sort of once upon a time, there was a world where, etc., kind of thing, I will implore you to find a different way and ground it in a character or a scene. If you must have the detached narrator prophecy prologue or something of that sort, then it might at least help to keep it pretty brief. The Star Wars title crawl, particularly the better ones of them, are about as long as you should get here. Maybe you could go a bit longer. They are very, very basic scene setting and not that much else. And if for some reason you feel that your only alternative other than doing this sort of thing is to have a character sit down and explain to the audience what's happening in the world, then one, I'd say you're lacking imagination. There's always another way. But two, I guess you can do the title crawl type thing, what I'm describing here. But before I get off track again, even the title crawl itself in Star Wars is given an advantage by being stylized the way that it is, giving the presentation itself a novelty that you may not have the means to do, especially if you're working with prose. So if you're going to do a prologue, I strongly recommend the set it in a scene with an alternate character approach. It might sound like that bottlenecks your options a little bit, but really the point is just to offer an alternative pair of eyes onto the setting. One that might be more or less knowledgeable than your protagonist might turn out to be. But even if you do this, which I personally consider one of the more reliable ways of pulling off a good prologue, though you can do it in other ways, you still need to be aware of this sort of thing. The thing I was most guilty of in terms of overworld building was the too many proper nouns issue, When Dingle von Dunkendonatdorf of Diabetia's small town of Don'tcarenstein is introduced in your prologue, and Dingle starts abstractly talking about the precursorian-made sort of poorly thought out plot devicia, you're going to lose your audience even if they do enjoy the concept of a character being named Dingle. The amount of things you can introduce in your prologue is directly proportional to how long you make it, and even with this approach, I'd recommend the prologue to typically be shorter than a normal chapter anyway, because even a good prologue is going to have the audience thinking, can I get to the real story pretty quick? So choose a character wisely and try to focus on the crucial elements that are going to be directly relevant to the upcoming story, particularly ones that are needed to be known by the audience, but might not come about naturally early in the story of the actual protagonist. Say, for example, the royal family of your kingdom is beset with plague, and the royal court is trying its best to hide that. A prologue with a court scribe observing the attempt to save their lives and hide the incident might have a purpose if the royal family's death to the plague will be relevant later on, especially because your protagonist, who for the sake of this example we'll say is an outsider to this land and would probably never have a chance to learn about this naturally. All of this creates a situation where if we didn't have the prologue, the royal family's sudden death to the plague in the narrative would feel that way. Sudden and poorly built up. During this hypothetical prologue, this scribe or whoever it is you're writing it from, who in a fairly high position would probably know more than your protagonist does anyway, could slip in some loose world-building pieces and conversations he has with others or any other such related thing. But of course, you do not need a prologue, and writing your beginning without one will naturally look a little different, though this might be useful even if you do have a prologue. Most stories, though obviously not all, start out with a brief segment of the protagonist's everyday life before the actual plot begins to happen. But even if it doesn't, because obviously many don't, even if you're getting a little in medias res action, the following principle I'm about to say is still going to apply. Whenever we're introduced to your protagonist, all we really need to understand right away is their immediate context. Whether it's the classic, they wake up and do their morning routine thing, or if they come into the narrative just regaining consciousness in a muddy, bloody ditch in the middle of a now deserted battlefield with half their leg torn off, you're still not going to make the first portion of your prose be detailing the long and complex history of dynastic lines or courtly politics. Unless, of course, that's the context your protagonist is in right away, which would be unusual, but at least then there'd be a reason. Think of your beginning, or the narrative as a whole really, as an expanding bubble of knowledge. At the start, it's quite contracted and focused, but as you build outward, more things will come into view, and this doesn't have to be in the tropey, my protagonist was a commoner, so doesn't know any more about the world than the audience does, sort of thing. It's more so that the expansion of the scope of relevant facts should grow in a controlled fashion, whether those relevant facts were already known to the protagonist or not. Let's apply this to our half-dead battlefield guy to make it a little more concrete. We'll name him Bartholomew, just like J. Bartholomew, yours truly. Bart for short. So Bart wakes up in this desolate war zone, and naturally his immediate concerns are going to be figuring out how to not die from the half-torn-off leg, and then figuring out where his allies went. He might not know if his side won or lost, and regardless of which of those is the case, what does that mean to him? There is a ton you can do with this kind of situation as well, prologue or not. In surveying the fallen, you might see the liveries of both his own side and his enemies and reflect on their causes. He might pass the fallen sword or horse of his dead commander, who might have been an officer or a nobleman who had some part to play in the mess that got your character here. With stuff like this, you're able to both provide us with an immediate in-world situation that's interesting, that being our protagonist is in danger and needs to find a way to patch himself up, alongside being sort of lost, while also having the context that he naturally exists in provide the reason for him to reflect on what to you is the setting and the world building. What I'm about to say, as with most other things, isn't one size fits all and may not apply depending on what you're doing. But if you find yourself stuck on this sort of thing, trying to figure out how to make this sort of introduction and find that balance, your best bet is honestly just to try and figure out how you'd naturally react and what you would be thinking about if you were in this context. One through line that connects a great deal of narrative fiction in general is that characters should almost by default be written to sound natural. And if they don't, it'll be picked up on by the audience, regardless of whether your intent is for the dialogue to actually be unnatural or not. It should be becoming obvious that a great deal of our topic today is in the orbit of the general "how do I start a story" question, as ultimately world building correctly in the beginning, introducing characters and conflicts, and everything else along those lines are what comprise your beginning, which I will say is almost always the hardest part of a story to write. The first page of your story is more important than the rest of it combined until you get it published, or at least to an agent, and even thereafter, that portion will still punch far above its weight. It's what people will see if they pick your book up in a store somewhere, or read a preview on Amazon or something. But to center our conversation back on the world building aspect of these introductions, I now want to talk about doing the world building you do introduce early correctly a little more. There's a challenge peculiar to speculative fiction and fantasy, which is that the audience cannot take any reality about the world they're reading about for granted. The moment you establish that you're beyond our normal standard Earth, everything is assumed to be up in the air, basically. Where you leave gaps, the audience will sort of fill them in with what makes sense, but you need to bear in mind that assumptions about the world that to you might be default are not going to be that way to the audience if you don't take care to shape their perceptions. When we spent so long developing these worlds, we come to know them so well that a lot of the facts we'd consider basic about them, including things as elementary as the names of countries or the general scale of the setting, important figures, these are all completely foreign to the reader until they see them, and especially when they don't have a real-life equivalent to attach these things to help them remember them, keeping them all straight in their mind is going to be a challenge. There's sort of a scale in fantasy ranging between urban on one end and high fantasy on the other, and I'm sure you're aware of these genres, and these two in particular being more or less opposites in a variety of ways, so I'm not going to rehash what you likely already know, but what the focus is that the scale essentially measures how far removed from the real world the setting is. In something like The Hunger Games, which is a speculative fiction of a sort, we can take the existence of Earth, of places like the US having formerly existed, a precedent for English being the standard language used both in the prose and in the world, and all that sort of thing. But if we move to, say, Warhammer 40k, which is pretty far on the other end of the spectrum, even though there was an Earth, there was a United States and all that sort of thing in its timeline, it's so incomprehensibly long ago and unknown about in world that it's even more obscure than things like the Indus River Valley civilization are to our modern-day civilization. The audience cannot take anything about the world of 40k for granted until they learn the basics of how that specific setting works. In a setting like 40k, you can't expect generally rational people by default. The history of the setting is immensely complex and widely distributed over hundreds of pieces of media. And for all it's being set in space, it is fundamentally a high fantasy setting. There's magic and non-human species and everything. This is one of many reasons that Hunger Games is a lot more accessible than Warhammer 40k. Which is so obvious to people who know both that it's probably funny to even make the comparison. None of that, nor these levels of accessibility, are better or worse than one another, but they do define several key differences in how you're advised to approach making them. You can basically just sit down and read something like The Hunger Games and get it pretty easily, though with something like that you might also find holes in the world building easier. But with something like Warhammer 40k, there are hour-long introduction to the lore videos. And if you haven't read this chunk of text first, the setting is going to make even less sense to you. However, of course, the payoff is that once you're into something like 40k, there is almost endless depth to explore and get lost in. So what does that mean for you? Essentially, how much time you need to spend reinforcing key concepts is directly correlated with that scale we talked about earlier. When you only have a few speculative elements, a slightly adjusted alt history, a fairly straightforward magic system in a contemporary setting, all that sort of thing. You don't need to reinforce these concepts in the reader's mind essentially at all, almost, because they'll come up frequently naturally anyway, but there being less overall concepts in general means that if you overuse them, they'll grow stale faster. On the other end of the scale, with a very complex and far-removed setting, you'd be well advised to reinforce key concepts. To use the 40K-like example, Imperial characters' devotion to the God Emperor of mankind becomes a sort of mantra, something you see in propaganda posters, in battle cries, even in everyday conversation, to a point that it becomes ingrained in you as an important part of the setting, something the characters do and say without giving it much thought at all. It's their normal, but to the reader it establishes just how different their existence really is from our own. The trick here, of course, is not to do a sign tap approach. I doubt anyone has found a truly perfect way to reinforcing the key concepts of high fantasy-esque settings without it getting overdone or overused at least a little bit, because it's a battle you'll be constantly fighting between keeping the audience informed but not hammering them over to the head that they get frustrated with seeing the same things constantly. The most important tool then is variation, and particularly an avoidance of using the narration to establish and reinforce world building too strongly. The way you use your narrator can obviously vary a lot in how much of a distinct personality they have, as they might well have opinions on everything happening or merely be an objective, hands-off observer, but frequently pausing things audiences generally find interesting, like dialogue or action, to drop a paragraph in the narration reminding the audience about the complex governance of the protagonist's home country, is going to get old so fast that they won't like it the first time you do it, probably. So implement said variation. Perhaps use the narration occasionally, because sometimes you just kind of need to, but let the characters live the world building. Let them discuss it naturally. Let them find it in the way society is structured, in things like propaganda posters, flags, art of all kinds, from grand architecture to graffiti. Make the important parts of the world building part of the tension. You should do this anyway, of course, but really ensure that these facts of your world are often relevant to your characters, and thus they'll become more relevant to your audience. It is easier to remember the John Smith of an urban fantasy, and urban fantasy writers would do well to take advantage of the time they save in establishing that kind of world to really polish the establishment they do have, and not end up like one of those countless post-apocalyptic YA novels that infested the 2010s, where the world building made no sense if you thought about it for more than 3 seconds. And on the other end of the spectrum, it may be harder to remember the Flamborbius Longenschlong I of the Empire of Imperia, but if you make Flamborbius's struggles important, if you make him desperately anxious about the Empire of Imperia's future, eventually that ridiculous name too will become as second nature to the audience. And if you find yourself in the middle of that spectrum I've been talking about, wanting to rely on some real-life conventions, but invent new things for your world on others, don't be afraid of that either, of course. I did that. My whole world is a sort of warped and distorted mirror of reality, adjusted thoroughly enough to hopefully stand well on its own, while still aiming to have enough backing conventions and particularly sort of allusions to real-life medieval history to avoid bogging it down with things that need to be explained all the time. None of us will ever likely get this perfect, but so long as you keep in mind the rate at which you balance out your world building, that all-important spice, with the rest of your storytelling, you should be able to pull it off and succeed at establishing a world that comes into its own. So that's the video. I'm surprised I danced around this topic for so long in previous videos, covering it in bits and portions but never giving it its time in the sun, but no longer. Anyway, if this sounds like a place you want to be, we have a Discord if you want to hang out with my editor and I, and a Patreon if you're crazy enough to want to support the channel. As we close out, I'd like to thank those patrons of ours: Shadowrunner, Sonny, Isaac Parrott, Raymond, Dawn, Sadako, and Cavalier of the Knights of the Inner Circle, Vion, Jodion Void, and Razor the Arcader, our knights, and Greer, TOW, and Craig, our loyal squires. And remember, if you want further guidance, you'll never go wrong simply reading more and seeing how others have done these sorts of things. Stop fucking doing that.